All right, everyone. Welcome to our second Fair Housing Town Hall. This is Mary Beth Yates coming to you from Housing Opportunities Made Equal of Virginia, where I am proudly the Director of Development. Today, I am with our President and CEO, Heather Crislip, and our Enforcement and Litigations Director, Alex Guzman. So thank you guys so much for joining me today. Our topic is going to be knowing your rights, source of income or funds protections. So before we start getting into some questions and answers about source of income protection, I wanted to throw it over to Heather first to talk a little bit about Fair Housing Month and why we're celebrating.
Yeah, Fair Housing Month is a big time in the life of home annually. We get asked to come speak. We do our best to respond to every request, but I thought it was useful to just pause and remember about why April is always Fair Housing Month. And that is because in 1968, in April of 1968, Martin Luther King was assassinated. And it took just 7 days after the assassination of Martin Luther King for the Federal Fair Housing Act to be passed, which is really rather remarkable. I think even at the time, it was a really speedy reaction to a moment of crisis. And the Fair Housing Act of 1968 had been left out of the landmark Civil Rights Act of 1964. The landmark 1964 Civil Rights Act covered public accommodations. It covered non-discrimination in education and in transportation. But at the time, housing was seen to be just a step too far. And it really took the assassination of Dr. King for fair housing to come to the forefront. So April is always celebrated as Fair Housing Month. I think it is both a testament to our system working in a moment of crisis and being able to respond to discrimination and inequities in our society. And that's really why we're here today, is to continue that legacy of trying to educate around systemic inequities and how fair housing can make our lives better.
Thank you so much for that, Heather. We are going to give you a little bit of background and talk about exactly what this protection means. And while we're doing that, if anybody has questions on today's topic, please feel free to type them in on this video stream, and we will be answering as many of your questions as possible at the end of today's video. So to give us a little bit more information about what we're talking about today, Heather, I'm going to give it to you again. Can you just tell us exactly what we mean by protections?
Yeah, I was really happy to see this question because I think it can be a little opaque to folks. What does that mean to be in a protected class or to have fair housing protections? So the way the Fair Housing Act works is that it prohibits discrimination in any housing or housing related transaction if that discrimination happened based on your membership in a protected class. So there are basic areas in which discrimination is prohibited. And classically, those protections have included race and color, national origin, sex, familial status, religion, and disability. And so when we say you're protected, that means that a landlord can't turn you away, or a mortgage loan couldn't not be issued if that just decision was made based on one of those things. So when we say protections, then we're talking also then about some new areas that have been added to the Virginia Fair Housing Act. So these are new areas that are now protected under Virginia's fair housing law. And we are in awe of the progress that Virginia made in the past year in adding protections for new protected classes. So the new protected classes include sexual orientation, gender identity, veteran status, and then finally the one we're going to talk about today, which is your source of income.
Great. Alex, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask Heather what she thought about the progress on source of funds, because I know that was something that was on our wish list, but that kind of came as a surprise in that last legislative session.
Absolutely. Source of income is something, or source of funds, so we use them rather interchangeably, is a protection that took a little convincing, I think, in the public eye to be able to extend. But Delegate Bourne really carried this very successfully. He was a landlord himself who had accepted housing choice vouchers. And so he was just an ideal advocate and really got this across the finish line. If we want to go into some background. So we have wanted source of income protections for a very long time. So source of income means that it doesn't matter what resources you use to pay your rent. And most practicably, this means folks who have a housing choice voucher that typically landlords have been able to turn you away because of you were using a voucher to pay your rent. And we saw this all over the place. And Home since 2014 has had a program that works with people who have vouchers to try to find them places where they could use that voucher and specifically find places in low poverty neighborhoods where they could use the voucher. And it was really very difficult. And so what we saw was that the general acceptability of vouchers would really improve the opportunities that were available to housing choice voucher holders. So we had done several studies, one back in 2014 and then one in 2019, where we just looked at every available listing to see if just in what they were publicly advertising, whether vouchers would be acceptable. And we can drop the link to that report into the Facebook and YouTube chats, either during or after we're done here. But what we found is almost 20 to 30% of all listings just from the get-go said they wouldn't accept a voucher. And that was really limiting people's ability to find housing.
Great. Awesome. All right. Our next question is, how are we at Home able to support individuals facing this sort of discrimination? And Alex, do you want to take that one first?
Yeah, I can take that. So I did want to expand a little bit on what Heather had said as well. I always go back to the text of the act. And so while our fight has always been kind of around housing choice vouchers, and I think generally you need to understand that as the federal government has phased out historically public housing units as we think of them, they have increased the amount of vouchers that are available to low-income folks. The problem that creates, of course, is as Heather described, when housing providers just won't take them. So you're limiting the units that were once available to people, and then giving them vouchers and further limiting their choice. So this was a really important protection for that reason. But it has been difficult kind of in this first not even a year since it's gone into implementation to get enforcement on the ground, because there have been some questions of interpretation as well. What is what counts as a source of funds? What portion of that person's source of funds actually counts towards a rental payment? And we can get into a little bit of that in a minute. But how are we able to help people who feel like they've been discriminated against because they're paying with a rental voucher or some other funds from a government or non-government entity? We can investigate and help advocate for those folks. So again, some of these questions are very complicated and situational. And you have to bring actions, individuals have to bring actions against individual housing providers. And so that is the value that we provide. We can help them sort of understand what their rights are, help them understand what the law is as it kind of pertains to their context. There are exemptions written into the law that regular folks just might not know about, and that can get confusing as well. We can test. I believe that we speak about testing almost every time we speak about fair housing, but that's a value that home provides as well. In investigating housing providers, we can see if they are treating people differently based on their source of funds or their race or their national origin, etc. And then finally, we can bring enforcement actions either through a fair housing complaint at the Virginia Fair Housing Office or through state or federal litigation, trying to enforce the Fair Housing Act in that way.
Great. Thank you, Alex. And for those of you that were not able to join us last week, we did talk a lot extensively about what our testers do and why they're so important. So if you want to learn more about who our testers are and how they play into deciding whether or not somebody is being discriminated against, I encourage everybody to go back and watch that video. Mm-hmm. Heather, do you have anything to add?
I'll just back up and provide a little context. So when you have a fair housing violation, you have a few options about enforcing it. One way is just to tell the landlord, look, the law's changed. You have to accept a voucher. And I think especially since this is a new protection, that might prove to be pretty effective. But if a landlord continues to deny your ability to use a voucher, you should always call us first, because we can help you file a complaint with the Virginia Fair Housing Office, which would probably be in these instances the most appropriate place to take your case. If we think it's necessary, we can back you up and do some testing to provide you with some more evidence to make your claim. We could also join you as an organizational plaintiff in some instances. And you also would have the option to take this action to state court and possibly federal court. It would depend on the circumstantial evidence of the case. But when you're talking about how to enforce these actions, if you've run into it as a problem, you should call us and we can help you navigate the process of filing a complaint.
Thank you. Our next question is around the fact that normally people see that requirement for income or funds is 3 times the base rent. Can you guys talk a little bit about how that was established, why it's something that landlords look for, and how that plays into source of income protection?
Do you want me to start, Alex, or do you want to?
Yeah, if you want to start, and then I
can go you'll sub in. Okay.
the source of income part.
Yeah, so it is very typical for a landlord to require that you demonstrate that you have either 2.5 or 3 times the amount of the rent in income, and want to look at pay stubs or look at other evidence that you're going to be able to handle the rent. That's a landlord requirement. Not all landlords do it, but many do. The landlord does that to make sure, because it kind of backs into the general idea that a housing is affordable to you if it takes 30% of your income or more. And that is just kind of a standard definition of what's affordable to any individual household. And so that has been a sticking point. In source of income protections, an early sticking point in how landlords apply that same criteria that they're applying to everyone to a voucher holder, right? Because the voucher holder could maybe only have an income of $1,000 a month, and they are looking to rent an apartment that is $1,000 a month, and but their portion of that income or of that rent is significantly smaller. So if a landlord is saying, well, you don't make $3,000 a month, so you're not eligible, in our opinion, and I think the opinion that's generally becoming accepted, that is a clear violation of the source of income protections that you have under the Virginia Fair Housing Law. We are really grateful that just recently the Real Estate Board has passed regulations along this effect that were drafted by the Attorney General of Virginia, and that has provided exceptional clarity on this point that I think every landlord who is considering how to take income into consideration in their decisions with a voucher holder should really make sure that they avail themselves of the guidance coming out of the Real Estate Board. But in a nutshell, you can take income into consideration, but only for the portion that the tenant is going to be responsible for. So let's take that theoretical client who has $1,000 a month in income. They're going to be responsible to pay 30% of their income towards housing. So their required contribution is going to be $300 a month. So the landlord can then say, well, you're going to have 3 times of that $300 a month in income. If that makes sense. Alex, do you want to clarify or add anything?
Sure. Yeah, so I'll go back just to the original question. A landlord has a vested interest in making sure that you can pay your rent, but not just pay your rent, but you've also got enough money to pay your utilities and put food on the table, et cetera, et cetera. So this sort of 3 times the rent rule is roughly derived from that. So there's no legislation per se that supports that. It's just an industry practice. Sometimes you might see 2 times the rent, you might see 3 times the rent, just depending on how much the rent actually is and the practices in that market. And so the question that had not been clarified for a long time, or with the passage of source of funds protections, was how should housing providers calculate a tenant's portion of the rent if they are receiving some subsidy, right? What portion do you actually calculate to assess your risk for taking on that tenant? And so luckily, the real estate board adopted some guidance recently, as Heather mentioned, that sort of clarifies this, for housing choice vouchers, because this is where it comes up most often. Mm-hmm. And it's specifically problematic when someone's voucher covers their entirety of the rent and utilities, right? And you still want to deny them, even though the subsidy directly covers what you believe it needs to cover. And so, as Heather stated, this guidance clarifies that. It clarifies it under Virginia law. So the Virginia Fair Housing Office will be using this guidance as it conducts its investigations. And hopefully housing providers are able to follow this guidance. I expect there will be more clarifying guidance for other types of income sources as we kind of move along into rent relief programs and things like that. So that might be a necessity, but housing choice vouchers are the biggest direct rental subsidy in the state, and therefore, this guidance has a huge impact.
Mary Beth, you're muted, but I'm going to jump in anyway and add that Alex brought up a really important point, and that is, we're focusing on housing choice vouchers, but there are a lot of other rental assistance programs, especially in the pandemic era, and this protection covers them as well. So if you have gotten, rent funds available through the rent and mortgage relief program through the state of Virginia, and your landlord declines to accept it to pay for your back rent, that would be illegal under Virginia's fair housing law. That it does not matter where the money comes from to satisfy your debt or your obligation.
Yeah. If I may, it's specifically defined as any source that lawfully provides funds to or on behalf of a renter or buyer of housing, including any assistance, benefit, or subsidy program, whether such program is administered by a governmental or non-governmental entity. So it's pretty far-reaching.
Mm-hmm.
Great. You actually read my mind. That is what I was trying to get you to say. So that was perfect.
We're very in sync.
I love it when that works out like that. Do you guys have any more on that topic, or are you ready to move on to our next question?
Bring it on.
Bringing it on? All right. we got a follow-up question on what you talked about. So it is, when calculating income for the tenant, can you specifically go over the example again, where how you add in the voucher and how to calculate what you're responsible for?
So the landlord can look at the tenant's portion of what they will owe, what the tenant's monthly obligation is, and then they can calculate to make sure that the tenant has whatever their typical standard is, whether it's 2.5 or 3 times the rent. That is the base number that they should use to conduct that calculation, not the contract rent. Because the balance of that, let's say in the example of a tenant who has $1,000 in income, they're responsible for $300. The landlord needs to look at that tenant's portion, not at the entire contract rent when they're calculating whether the tenant has enough income to sustain the lease.
Great. Thank you for going over that one more time. I think that's really important for people as they start to determine whether or not they might be facing discrimination.
And we'll also provide a copy of the guidance, which also provides similar explanations and examples for calculations as well.
Fantastic. So if somebody feels like they would like more information on this, you can visit our website, which is homeofva.org. Again, home, HOME of VA.org. And you can find more information about our fair housing work and protections. How does somebody know if they are being discriminated against? And if they think that they are, how do they prove it?
Fine question, Mary. You may not know, is kind of the short answer. Discrimination these days can be rather insidious, especially discrimination on the basis of race or national origin. That's what we often term discrimination with a smile and a handshake, misrepresenting availability, quoting different rental terms on the basis of race. And if you're having a singular experience, I walk in, I only know what my experience is with that housing provider. So oftentimes, as mentioned before, we rely on testing in a lot of those cases, but not always, not exclusively. As far as source of funds discrimination, I think because the law is still so new and there's some kind of nuanced exemptions, we're still seeing a lot of Section 8 advertisements, seeing some different rental terms quoted for people with, a rental subsidy versus those who do not have a rental subsidy. The ways that their portions of the rent are being calculated as well might automatically qualify as a refusal to rent on the basis of source of funds. And so there are a variety of, discrimination takes many forms. And so you might not know off the bat, which again is why we're here, to try and help you suss out whether or not you've been discriminated against and how to try and enforce those rights if you have them.
Heather, anything to add?
Yeah, Alex is absolutely right. I mean, there's a reason why Home is turning 50 this year, and that's that these issues have become more and more complicated and more insidious and with layers of obfuscation. On source of income, though, I do think that this, at least in the near term, this is an area where the discrimination will probably be pretty straightforward. It will be a voucher, or it will be a landlord refusing to accept a voucher. And so we have the advantage for the moment of these cases hopefully being fairly straightforward and clear cut, just as people get acclimated to the new law.
Great. We are starting to wrap up here, so don't forget to get those questions in. If you have anything else, we do have a little bit more time, so get those questions in if you have them. And while we're waiting for those to come in, I'm going to ask if you can please go over the protected classes again. We do have another installment of our Fair Housing Town Hall that's going to be coming up on April 27th, when we're going to go over the gender identity and sexual orientation protections. But can you talk a little bit more about what the other protections are, the regular ones and the new ones that we added in 2020, so that everybody can kind of start getting an idea of whether or not they need to be looking out for something?
Sure. Alex, I'm going to tick them off, but then why don't you also talk about which ones we see most often, and maybe give a little context about what we typically see come in the door. So the federal protections that are also covered on, so those are protections that are covered under federal law, but also the Virginia Fair Housing Law. And those are race, separately color, religion, national origin, sex, familial status, and disability. And then Virginia, in addition, has always covered elderliness. I think I left that off when I was speaking at the beginning. So elderliness is protected under the Virginia Fair Housing Law, but not under federal law. And then starting on July 1st of 2020, Virginia added 4 additional protected classes. And those are sexual orientation, gender identity, veteran status, and then source of income, which is what we've been talking about today. So Alex, why don't you talk about, we typically get about 200 intakes in any given year, and they definitely have patterns to them.
Yes, that is true. Race, disability, claims are probably the highest that we see, and that is, I think, because many of us still fail to understand disabilities, the protections around disabilities. There are extra protections for people with disabilities under the Fair Housing Act for them to request a reasonable accommodation or modification. And sometimes people just need help requesting those as well. So I think that's likely why those are kind of the highest claims. Those are followed by race, and now increasingly I've seen an exponential increase in source of income claims as well. So as Heather alluded to earlier, I think because it's such a new protection, those discrimination claims are coming in very fast. I'd be remiss though if I didn't say this is also a racial justice issue. 73% of voucher holders in Virginia are Black. And so by denying a voucher holder on the premise of their voucher, you're essentially denying a large swath of people on the basis of their race. And so even though these protections exist, there are also ways to expand our conception of these protections through disparate impact theory. And probably too late to go into much of that, but yeah, that's where we are. I'm very excited now to actually have a protection in place for a source of income, because I think that it's about addressing our systemic failures and our systemic racial discrimination in housing.
Yeah, I'll add one other big picture observation, and that is, we make as a society a huge investment with the Housing Choice Voucher program. We are spending billions of dollars for Housing Choice Voucher holders to get, some ability to get a leg up and to be able to afford housing. And when landlords won't accept those vouchers, that really undercuts how far what we are getting out of that public investment. If voucher holders are able to live in communities where they can more easily find jobs or be in better schools, that is the intent that we set out to fulfill when we set up the Housing Choice Voucher program. So I truly believe that this protection is a game changer, a long term for the success of families. And I'm so proud of Virginia for adopting this as a statewide protection. It really was a really historic achievement.
We have 2 questions that have come in. So if you guys don't mind answering them for our viewers. The first is actually about another protected class that we just talked about. Somebody wrote in and asked specifically about the enforcement of disability protections when it comes to invisible disabilities. Is that harder than, somebody with maybe a more obvious disability, more traditionally discussed disability?
Whether enforcement is harder, I don't know is necessarily the question as much as it is getting housing providers to understand the needs of someone with one of these invisible disabilities. So let me just start off by saying the definition of disability is very wide. It is any physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more life activities and can include, as you've alluded to, our physical disabilities, but can also include things such as PTSD, autism, those recovering from alcohol or drug addiction. And so the needs for each of those disabilities is different, and you might request a reasonable accommodation or modification such that it, one that you need to actually have your housing opportunity and enjoy it fully. And getting that accommodation, getting the housing provider to understand why you need that accommodation might be the challenge. And so from there, though, if you've got your paperwork, the actual request in writing submitted and a refusal, you can submit a fair housing complaint at that time for refusal to accommodate.
So the part 2 of that question is going to be, how can people find more information about invisible disabilities and disabilities at large when it comes to these protected classes?
Sure. So I would start at our website. I think we've got just a wealth of resources on disability specific protections. We've also done a number of disability specific fair housing trainings for tenants and service providers, so that they know how to write a reasonable accommodation, for example, or when they've been discriminated against. I'd also, rely heavily on our partners, not just in housing, but the Disability Law Center is an incredible resource as well.
Great. And our website, again, is homeofva.org. You can find information there about the different disability protections, as well as all of the other protections that we're talking about today, source of income being the primary one. And you can also figure out how to get in touch with our fair housing team. They would love to hear from you if you have any questions to be able to talk through your specific case. Our last question for the day is going to be, does a credit score requirement factor into source of income protection at all?
That is a really good question.
My first response is going to be that as I look at the definition of the Virginia of source of funds in the Virginia Fair Housing Law, no. But I'm going to go back to these questions of disparate impact and discriminatory effect, and question whether certain criteria or even the development of a credit score might in fact be discriminatory on the basis of race or national origin or some other protected class. It's a good question.
That's a very astute question from our viewers, Mary Beth. I concur with Alex. My gut is no, but I do think that would be a really interesting area to try to explore and see if there was a way to get at that, because we do know that credit scores are a huge barrier to housing, and becoming more and more often used in rental scenarios because they're so much easier to access these days through tenant screening software and the like.
Wonderful. Thank you guys so much for tackling that hard question that really hasn't been investigated yet. So that is something that we will start to look into. And it is because of questions like that that we know what to pursue next. So thank you very much for submitting that question. Was there anything that our viewers didn't ask or I didn't ask that you all were really hoping to talk about today?
I think I hit all the major points. What about you, Heather?
Yeah, I think that covers it. But if you're a housing provider and you're trying to wrestle with how to implement these or be in compliance with these new regulations, I'd refer you to the guidance that just came out from the Virginia Real Estate Board. And if you're a consumer that has experienced housing discrimination, please reach out to us.
Great. And again, just like Heather said, tenants and providers alike, please feel free to use us as a resource. We are here for both sides to make sure that everybody is educated and informed. So thank you so much to everybody who joined us today for our second Fair Housing Town Hall. Our next session will be on Friday, April 23rd, when we talk about redlining in Richmond and its impacts on our community today. So till then, we will see you soon. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Happy Fair Housing Month.
Happy Fair